Okay. Morning, everyone. Welcome to VizSec. This is our opening. My name is Chris Bryan. I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University. I'm the general chair for this year's VizSec. So there's my Twitter handle and the VizSec Twitter handle and the link to the VizSec site for this year. So this is the opening, and to start it off, I'd like to welcome everyone to Oklahoma City. We're back in person, and I feel really happy that after 2 years we're somewhat back in person. I know there's also folks online, so I don't want to leave them out, right? So we're back in person. We're also kind of online. So it feels nice. Oklahoma City, it's a great city. It's a little cold today. Coming here from the Phoenix area, we're hitting about 90 degrees today. So I'm not taking this temperature very well, but it's a bit of a shock to my system. But nice to be back in person. So this is the 19th edition of VizSec. And VizSec is a forum for researchers and practitioners from academia, government, industry, addressing needs of cybersecurity, the cybersecurity community, through new and insightful visualization and analysis techniques. Right, so there's kind of an intersection here, three actors: academia, government, and industry. That's one of the things that I think makes VizSec really interesting. It's a really interesting symposium. The fact that it's not just academia, but it's also industry and government. So how do we describe VizSec? Or how do we kind of see it? I think the keywords that we have in our call for papers do a nice job of just kind of describing the breadth of topics that we look at the intersection of visualization and security. So, right, so viz and security are, right, these are the two main terms that we focus on. But there's things like data protection and privacy, right? Very important, right? You want to secure your data. Computer forensics, techniques and interfaces for that. Or machine learning and explainable AI in the context of cybersecurity. Visual analytics for cybersecurity. Computer networks, right? Defending networks against attacks. Critical infrastructure, right? The cybersecurity needs are increasingly important, right? As we see increased attacks and threats against critical infrastructure. Adversarial visualization. This is a new one that we're seeing more and more of. A malware analysis. Incident handling, triage. Situational awareness, understanding when an event happens, how can we use visualization to be aware of it. Blockchain, this is another one that's emerging. And security configurations, analyzing those. Vulnerability management, evaluation and testing. Human-centered evaluation in the context of cybersecurity. Human factors goes along with that. Mobile application security, training education, and privacy engineering. So there's a big breadth of topics within this ecosphere of visualization and security. So for this year, the program chairs put together a very nice call for papers, and they accepted 4 types of papers: full papers, short papers, position papers, and posters. And in particular, the best full paper has the potential to go to TVCG. So that's one of the benefits of this symposium. We had 13 submissions and 5 accepted papers. So that's a 38% acceptance rate. 4 full papers, 1 short paper. No position papers this year. And we have a couple of posters too. So looking a little bit VizSec year to year over the past couple of years, these have been kind of weird years with COVID. And so we see 2020, 12 submissions. Last year with a fully virtual conference, we jumped up to 21 submissions. This year we went back to 13. So, a little bit of uncertainty, I think, with the hybrid format is maybe a factor there, but we've been pretty consistent. We only accept high quality work at VizSec, and you can see that reflected in our acceptance rates. No position papers this year again, but we do have four full papers and one short paper. So this is a list of the papers that were accepted this year. So you can see they touch on some of the topics that were that were listed on the previous slide, right? So looking at things like a design space for cybersecurity, a survey of the design space, an explainable AI paper, looking at classification explanations, papers on computer networks, and risk inspection, so privacy analysis and protection for open data sets. We also have 4 papers, we also have 4 posters this year. So these are accessible on the Viz virtual site. So where the main Viz posters are, you can go to that tab. And so these are included in there. There's at least 1 or 2 that are also located in the poster room. So I'd encourage you to go by and see those and talk to the authors if you see them. They're really interesting work. Posters are a great way to kind of showcase early and emerging work in VizSec. And so hopefully, these 4 posters are turned into papers next year. We also have awards in VizSec. We have a Best Paper Award. This was selected by a separate committee than the reviewers. And it gets promoted to a TVCG paper. So we'll announce the best paper. Steve, one of our program co-chairs, he'll announce the best paper at the start of our next session, at the start of the poster session at about 10:45. We also have a best poster out of the 4 that were submitted. And we will announce that one right before we start our closing ceremony, which will be about 3 o'clock. So that's our afternoon session, the one that goes into the closing. So it'll be announced then.
Hello, my name is Peter Wonka, and I will present an overview of the visual computing.
I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Fraunhofer IGD. They've been a long-time supporter of VizSec, supported us through several years. So I'd just like to say thank you to them for continuing their support and recognizing
we strive for academic
the importance of visualization.
As evidenced by high rankings from websites, such as CS rankings.
I'd also like to recognize the organizing committee. They did all the work planning this, putting it together. I'm standing up here, but really we couldn't have put this together without really the hard work of all the OC members. So, Sanchari Das, she's at the University of Denver, and her and Steve Gomez at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. There are 2 program co-chairs, so they organized the program. Lindsay Franklin at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. She's our publications chair. Noelle at Worcester Polytechnical Institute. She's our publicity chair. Fabian at the University of Regensburg is our posters chair. And Alex Ulmer at Fraunhofer IGD is our web chair. So really just want to recognize that they've all done really good work. Really proud to have them as the organizing committee team for this year. Yeah. It's nice when they make me look good. So I was very happy that they worked so hard to make me look good. I'd also like to recognize the steering committee. So they have been a great resource for helping steer VizSec through the years and a reference point whenever we needed help or questions. So Marco Angelini at University of Rome, La Sapienza, Dustin Arendt at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Sophie Engel at the University of San Francisco, Robert Gove at CrowdStrike, Jordan Kohlhammer at Fraunhofer IGD, and Diane Stahaley at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. So thank you to the steering committee. And then finally, also thank you to our program committee, and truly an international program committee. So they helped review papers and posters, did a very good job. Again, we go through a quite rigorous review process. So we take a lot of pride in being a high quality symposium that only accepts good work. So thank you to all the program committee members as well. Okay, so the schedule for today, just an overview of the program. So right now we're in the opening, and in a few minutes we're going to start the keynote, a really interesting talk. We'll take a normal break, 10:15 to 10:45. Session 2 is where all our 5 papers will be presented. Then we'll have another break for lunch. Session 3, which goes from 2 to 3. I don't know why there's an XX there. I forgot to fill that in. So this always happens in my class lectures too. There's always one mistake on a slide, and I always call it out, and it's really awkward like this. So we'll just keep pushing through it. So 2 to 3, we're going to have a panel. I'm really excited about this. So one of the things, we actually collect feedback every year at VizSec. And one thing that people were really interested in last year was, one of the responses we got was interest in doing panels. So it's cool that we're able to do that this year. And so that'll be led by our other program chair, Sanchari. So translating real needs for cyber operations into impactful R&D. And then to close, we'll do the poster awards, and we'll have a short closing section. Closing session. Okay, so whether you're here in person or if you're watching online, you can participate in VizSec. So the virtual Viz site is a great resource for doing that. Right, it's got access to the Slido. So that's what we use to ask questions at Viz this year. We're the opinion room, the opinion Slido. So during the keynote, the paper session, or the panel, use Slido to ask questions. We also have the Discord, right? There's the Viz Discord that's available for further discussion, networking. We can chat after VizSec has ended. We have VizSec on Twitter, so just the handle's at VizSec. And then we'll also be posting a survey. So we'll post this during the closing session, and it's an opportunity to collect feedback. So if there's things you like, things you didn't like, things you'd like to see in VizSec. Again, we kind of operate at this intersection of industry, government, and academia. So we can do some really interesting or unique things. So it's a good opportunity to provide input about that. We also have some swag. I believe it's on the back table there. We have some data blockers, and we also have some stickers. So feel free to take some swag. If it disappears, you can talk to our publicity chair, Noelle. You can find her and bug her for the swag. But feel free to take the data blockers or the stickers. Okay, so today's keynote is going to be given by Jordan Krauser, Dr. Jordan Krauser. He's an associate professor at Smith College. He's a visual analytics researcher, semi-professional data wrangler, and an associate professor of computer science. He enjoys teaching introductory programming, the theory of computation, data visualization, machine learning, and his research program investigates kind of the complementary nature of the human and machine computation. It's used in visual analytics and other human-machine collaborative systems. So these systems make use of the human visual system as well as our capacity to understand and reason about complex data. He chairs the VAST Challenge, which was held earlier this week. And he's published technical contributions in the areas of visualization theory, human-computer interaction, educational technology, visual analytic systems, and human computation. So prior to returning to academia, Dr. Krauser spent 2 years doing research and building analytical tools at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. So let's all give a hand to Jordan as he comes up and gets set up for his keynote.
All right, bear with us a sec. I want my own dongle. then let's get the lav mic on so I don't have to stand behind this podium. Good? Sound good? All right, awesome. Thank you so much for welcoming me to VizSec. Thanks to Chris and to Steve and the organizers for inviting me. So I gave a nice, oh, where'd my slides go? Thinking about it. Yeah, we okay? All right, we're okay. So I gave this nice generic talk title for someone who's not generally a VizSec researcher. All right, this is killing me. Hold on. We'll go back to the other dongle. Keeping it real. Just keeping it real. It's all good. Okay, so I gave this nice generic talk title for, we're going to talk about emerging trends in data science, right? If you've been around VizSec for a couple of years, you haven't seen my face for a little bit. And when Steve reached out to ask me to give the keynote, I was like, interesting choice, right? But as we were speaking, Steve and I were talking about how we've been kind of watching VizSec. I've been watching VizSec from a little bit of a distance for the past couple of years, and noticing some ways in which the world outside VizSec might inform what we're doing here and vice versa. I'm going to talk a little bit about the outside in, because that's the perspective I'm coming from, but I'm really excited about this year's talk because, or this year's talks coming later this morning, because so many of them are starting to address these kinds of themes, right? What can we learn from VizSec that teaches us something about how to do analysis, how to find interesting patterns? So I hail from Smith College up in New England in Massachusetts. We are currently missing the beautiful fall season, but it's okay. You're worth missing a week of foliage. So I run the Human Computation and Visualization Laboratory at Smith College. Smith is a historically women's college, and we are an undergraduate-only institution, so a small liberal arts college or a SLAC. People often ask me, how do you run a research program without graduate students? We just scale, right? Scale it way up. And so the students that I highlighted in yellow have presented either at Viz or a Viz adjacent conference in the past couple of years. A great many of them are involved in, say, the VAST Challenge. So Chris mentioned that I chair the VAST Challenge. So my students have been instrumental in generating data sets for the VAST Challenge and in sort of thinking more broadly about how do we bring a liberal arts perspective to doing scholarly work in the Viz community. I see a couple of liberal arts alums out in the audience. That makes me smile. So I sit kind of at the intersection of, so my primary appointment is in computer science at Smith. I've got, I guess, a courtesy appointment, or I'm on the steering committee for the statistical and data sciences program at Smith. So we were one of the first liberal arts colleges to offer a major in data science specifically for undergraduates. And my work is kind of in the middle there, right? I think a lot about how do humans make sense of their data using interactive visualization as a medium? How does the way that we formulate that interaction and how we encode those visual mappings, how does that change how the human is thinking about the world around them? How does that modulate their behavior? And how do we move beyond things like assuming that a human is just kind of a little plug and play widget that we can add into a computational system like any other piece of hardware? And so my watch is buzzing right now to remind me to do a scary thing that I told myself I was going to do last night. I was sitting at dinner with a bunch of graduate students. Many of them are getting ready for their first talk. And we were talking a lot about sort of strategies for how do you, particularly in the wake of a pandemic that has sort of, I don't know about you, but my social skills have atrophied, as have many of my public speaking skills. But in talking with these students, I realized so many of us are nervous about coming back and giving a talk in person, right? So I guess I just wanted to say that, to say, your keynote speaker feels a little bit nervous about giving a talk, feels a little bit nervous about giving a talk as a purported expert in something, right? You don't usually just invite a rando to give a keynote, but I'm not an expert in this. And I noticed a lot of that sentiment coming out in the students that I was talking with, like, how do I stand up here and hold the attention of an audience and act like I'm an expert? You are an expert. Maybe you're talking to people who are experts in something else and that feels scary. But if I've got a platform and I just got tenure so you can't fire me now, and I wanted to address that. I wanted to take a minute out of this talk to say to the students, to say to people who are nervous about being back at Viz in person, that's normal. Right? That's human. So thanks for listening to that for a sec. Okay, so random guy sits at the intersection of computer science and data science, thinking about how do humans make sense of the world around them through interactive visualization, through looking at data, through trying to build mental models. And how does that come to bear specifically in a VizSec context? And so I was thinking back about, all right, well, I used to be involved in VizSec. This used to be my world. Where was I, when I was more active in the VizSec community, what was I thinking about? What were the things that felt important to me to spend my time researching? So I went back and looked at what my last publication at VizSec was. It was back in 2014. It was with Diane Staley and Blaine Harrison, Sean McKenna, lots of familiar VizSec faces. This was when I was at Lincoln Laboratory, having just graduated, escaped from Remco Chang's lab. And we were looking at, all right, so we've got all of these, it's the same problem that we see in a lot of Viz areas, right? We've got lots of one-off solutions that are designed to solve a very specific problem. How do we know we did that well? How do we know we're doing a good job, right? When we're building one-off systems, we've been talking about this in Believe for, a decade or a little longer, right? How do we evaluate these systems in a way that tells us something meaningful, something actionable, maybe even something generalizable? So when we were looking at, we took a whole bunch of VizSec papers and then sort of extrapolated out from there, right? This is kind of Jordan's MO. If you look at my Google Scholar, you'll see, well, when Jordan gets confused, he just goes to the library, right? He just reads and reads and reads and reads and reads and tries to come up with some sense of direction for where to go, kind of based on where we've been so far. And so thinking about how we were doing evaluation, how we were, back in 2014, right, this is a little bit ago, how we were trying to convince ourselves that we had taken a step forward, right? And there were, I won't go over this too much, you can read the paper if you want, but we were thinking a lot about, well, measuring success sort of matters, your metrics matter a lot, right? Are we talking about how effectively someone is utilizing the interaction, right? So are they using a broad diversity of interactions? Are they using just a lot of them? Are there long gaps in their interactions? What kinds of interactions, what kinds of representations are we talking about here? Because when we're trying to compare, when we're trying to measure the efficacy of one system to solve a task against another, the details of that task are important. We also thought a lot about what kinds of information are we talking about here? Are we talking about trying to help someone navigate a hierarchical set of metadata, or to build a knowledge base, or to connect entities to one another? Does it matter what computing hardware you're working on, right? Are we talking about system efficacy in terms of throughput, in terms of data density that we can display? And then there's sort of the elephant in the room talking about, well, what is the user's goal? What did they sit down to do? How did this change their mental model? How did this maybe inform their action or give them a competing hypothesis? So TLDR, evaluation is hard. So folks that are now in 2022, I said that if we had fewer than 50 people in the room, I was going to require audience participation. So here we are. It's still hard, right? Those of you who are tool builders, how do you know you built something good? Well, maybe the one analyst that you get a chance to sit and talk with says, well, that's better than I had before, right? Evaluation continues to be hard. In thinking about the VAST Challenge earlier this year, so I got to chair the VAST Challenge session, which means I got to listen to lots and lots and lots of smarter than me people talk about their approach to this data set. And this year's challenge was much more open-ended. So we simulated people walking around a fictitious town. We generated about 19 gigs of data, and we dumped it in somebody's lap, and we said, what's happening? Well, that feels a little bit more like what we do, right? Somebody dumps a giant pile of data, or you have a fire hose and someone's like, here, take a sip, right? Data is coming in at enormous volumes. You don't have a specific attack signature that you're looking for. If we do, we're so grateful. I know how to find something that I know what it looks like, right? But so how do I evaluate if I'm doing a good job if I don't have a needle in a haystack to find? So I'm gonna zoom in for a second on the thing that caught my attention next as we were walking through this. So there are many authors on there who are better equipped to evaluate in all of these other areas, but the interactive visualization part, that's the part I know, right? So fast forward a couple of years, I had left MIT and I had moved on to Smith College, and I had a couple of students who were like, well, I just want to do something for the summer. What could I do for the summer? And so I said, go to the library. Right? That's my approach when I don't know what to do. And so I had some students who were looking at a 10-year retrospective of VizSec. So they took all of the proceedings of VizSec for the last 10 years, so 2007 to 2017, or maybe this was a year or two earlier than that. And they focused in on the visual encodings that we were using, right? So this was a period of rapid evolution in kind of the InfoViz world, right? We were coming up with all kinds of exciting new visual metaphors, and we wanted to know, how is that translating, right? We come here together every year. These things have been co-located for quite a long time, and yet sometimes it feels like they're two different conferences, right? Our focus on the application makes us unique, and the specifics of that application are unique, right? We have this sort of bizarre proxy. We know that what we're really looking at here is human behavior, right? Computers don't attack other computers. That's humans. But we're not directly observing the human behavior. We're observing traffic. We're observing a botnet that's expanding. But go up a level, right? What we really care about is the human behavior. So my students were thinking a bunch about all of the different visual encodings that were being used, what we understood about how those visual encodings maybe amplified bias or helped to suppress it, et cetera. And we noticed a couple of kind of interesting trends. So I said they took 10 years of proceedings of VizSec. And this bar chart just shows, it's a little tiny, but you can zoom in on the video if you want. Shows just node link diagrams, tables, timelines. They went through and they manually sort of categorized the kinds of visual encodings that were being used here. I will not totally rehash this talk, but I'm going to pull out some interesting highlights to kind of remind you of 5 years ago-ish where we were thinking, right? Sort of what the state of the world was. And then I'm going to ask you to kind of fast forward with me, right? And to tell me what's changed. So as I'm talking about this, think about a couple of these years have been a little rocky, right? We haven't been in person for a while. I don't know about you, my research agenda sure slowed down in the wake of a pandemic. But so what's changed in the last 5 years? So one of the things that we noticed is this sort of two distinct ways of trying to visualize networky data, right? And I'm not talking about network in the domain context that we usually mean it, where we're talking network traffic, but network as in entities that are connected to each other, right? So some sort of relationship between entities rather than just rows and columns. We saw lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of node link diagrams, right? Lots of ball and stick diagrams, which unsurprisingly generally turn into a big spaghetti tangle as soon as we start to scale up to anything VizSec size, right? We saw about a third as many sort of shifting to a matrix view, saying, well, okay, since our network is very dense, what if we used a more compact visual encoding, right? Does that help us to be able to better interpret the patterns that we care about, better than a spaghetti diagram? Okay. We also noticed some interesting approaches to dealing with high-dimensional data, right? So you could just show it as a table, right? We do that all the time. When I don't know how to encode it, I'll just make you look at it symbolically. We also saw parallel coordinates in there. We had a great debate in the visualization literacy meetup earlier this week about parallel coordinates and sort of what they do and don't offer us in terms of utility. And so this sort of begged the question, right? So we have two distinct ways of showing two important kinds of data in the VizSec world. What's happening over time? How is that shifting? So then we plotted these, right? 2008, 2009. So the pink one's on the bottom, that's a node link diagram. The darker coordinated purple, that's the matrix view on top. And then we have parallel coordinates in dark green and some other table in light green, and then all the other visualizations are on top. But so we can see that a huge proportion of all of the visual encodings that were used over 10 years of Viz are dedicated to these two things, right? To trying to articulate connections between entities and to trying to give somebody an overview of what is the state of the data and what are the global patterns, right? It's like, so the relative proportion of publications featuring these is very high. Almost half of the publications every year feature at least one of these. And I didn't double count here, so there's more unique instances of these kinds of visualizations than almost anything else combined. And we're seeing this sort of shift, right? That the node link diagram, we kind of always, stick there. But we're seeing this higher proportion of looking at matrix views, of seeking out more condensed representations of this connected data. Over time, I think as the shift from I just want to be able to detect a particular attack signature to I actually want to do sense making about the entities that are involved in this attack. We see the same thing, sort of trying out parallel coordinates, trying to figure out as this sort of gained traction in other areas of Viz, is this going to work for us? Does this help us to see signals in the noise that we couldn't see when we're just looking at individual entities? Okay, so we looked at the visual encodings, and we wanted to understand how these visualizations were being used in context, because I had asked earlier, well, maybe it matters what the person's trying to do, right? Maybe just this sort of bean counting isn't giving us the whole story. So then we did some text analysis, and I threw these all into multidimensional scaling, projection, looking at just a TF-IDF score of their keywords, right, or the words that come out of the raw text of the document. And so then we said, okay, let's do some kind of clustering analysis on this, just simple k-means, and then let's just look at the top words that are in each cluster, right? So kind of poor man's way of doing document clustering, and we found some kind of neat things here. So if we look at this blue cluster, right, and my boundary isn't perfect, but here we're seeing the top 5 words of all of the papers that exist in that cluster are things like IP, port, hosts, traffic, packet, right? And so I pulled out an example here from Chen et al. This is the Oceans paper from 2014. And so when we looked at these, it seemed like the unifying theme across all of this work was forensic analysis, right? I'm diving down into raw traffic data, raw log files, trying to understand the sort of whodunit, the what happened. Most of them were retrospective. And so I'll leave to the reader a little bit what specific visualizations you imagine they might have used for that. But that was different from, say, when we looked at the green cluster here, where we're talking about analyst, task, models, cyber, alerts. Those are very different framing. That's a very different altitude to be looking at this problem from. And these feel a little bit more like situational awareness questions. So Dustin's Ocelot paper from 2015 kind of fell into this category, right? Like, what if we were trying to support the analyst's reasoning, the analyst's sense-making on this kind of data, rather than can I detect a signal in the noise? Can I trigger a cognitive action in the analyst? We also saw a bunch of could have appeared at a graph theory conference papers. So these were talking about attack graphs, nodes, vulnerabilities, exploits. Really here, this was about network defense. And I'll show you kind of an interesting temporal pattern in a minute between this network defense. So Lane Harrison's Nessus Viz paper, sorry for my line break there, but that's a 2012 paper. Compare that with Poltergeist. This last little cluster, which you'll notice is not actually a cluster, right? There's these sort of distinct little pockets that are talking about malware, execution, virus, sampling, images. And these were, so the SEAM paper by Robert Gove and co. 2014 kind of falls into this. It says, looking at how do I figure out what this piece of malware is doing? How is it, what exploit is it, or what vulnerability is it exploiting? If we look at these over time, we see this kind of interesting back and forth between some of these. So if we look up at the green and the blue, same colors as before, or rather, let's go down first. So we're seeing this interesting kind of ebb and flow, right? We're thinking about network defense. We're thinking about network defense. Something bad happened. What happened? Network defense. Something bad happened. There's this back and forth, this tug between, are we thinking about this specific exploit and trying to unpack what happened? What did we learn from that, and how does that change our network defense posture? So when I was a grad student, I remember Remco Chang's job talk when he came to Tufts. And the thing that made me sit outside his office and say, I need an advisor, and I want it to be you, and wear him down until he said yes, was in his job talk, he was talking about his work with trying to detect financial fraud at Bank of America. And the thing that he said that caught my attention was, if we're going to have any hope in a sort of human-generated data context, we're going to need better, faster, smarter human intelligence, because the bad guys are humans too, right? Recognizing that there's this dynamic interaction between the solutions that we build and the vulnerabilities that are exploited next, right? The attacks that come next. There's this dance that's happening back and forth in this adversarial context in a way that I think is not true at Viz proper, right? Sort of not universally true, that we are constantly aiming at a moving target. There are many other applications of that too, but that's sort of a unifying theme, regardless of what level we're working at, right? Whether we're down kind of at the forensic analysis, looking at packets, or whether we're up thinking about situational awareness. This dynamic adversarial context, I think, makes some of our problems a little bit more tricky. All right, keeping an eye on my time. So thinking also about the relationship between these forensic analysis and the situational awareness stuff, we're seeing a little bit more of a cone, right? So early in VizSec, we were doing a lot of forensic analysis, right? The name of the game was, how the hell do I look at this? Right? There's such a high volume of data. I can't rely on geography the way that other people can when they're talking about a topology, right? Because geography in cyber isn't the same. Like the topology and topography of that landscape doesn't match the physical landscape. And yet the physical wires that we are transmitting information over have an effect on those signals. How do we deal with that dissonance? Right? And as we get kind of more into the sort of heyday of visual analytics starting to take root, we're seeing this shift away from forensic analysis into situational awareness, right? Starting to think about analyst thinking. Okay, so as promised, fast forward 5 years. Apart from the obvious, right? Apart from I look at a sea of faces and I only see some faces, right? And we're trying desperately not to breathe on each other. And we've lived the past 2.5 years of our lives disembodied in a screen, and well, this one really affects us, right? We shifted a species of 8 billion organisms who are social in nature to interacting almost entirely virtually. That changes what we do here, right? Talk about a dynamic threat landscape. So I'll invite you back to talk about this in a second, but I thought maybe I would amplify this paper. I did not write this one. This comes out of some folks at Warwick, but they looked at the cyber threats immediately following COVID. They made this timeline. The specific details of the timeline don't matter, but this paper is great. So this is cybersecurity in the age of COVID-19. And I wanted to highlight that the time between the first COVID-19 case being announced, right, in China, so that was December 8th, 2019. And the first reported COVID-19 inspired cyber attack, 30 days, right? 30 days to react to a global pandemic, right? Remember that the bad guys are humans too, so they're existing in this pandemic at the same time. To figure out a social vulnerability, right? And exploit it on a large scale. So that first one was the Metaljack malware attack. But give me another 2 weeks, and we saw the first denial of service attack on a public health website that was specifically targeting COVID-19 prevention strategies. Right? So we had Vicious Panda before that. Maybe it took a full 2 months, right, to DDoS a public health website, right? And what was great and terrible about that attack is it DDoSed the actual public health website and then spoofed it to scrape contact information. Right? So not only are we we're suppressing the actual epidemic prevention units, but we're disguising as the Public Health Commission in order to exploit people's desperation for that information, right? That is not computers attacking computers, right? We have to think about social engineering. We have to think about that the biggest threat to cybersecurity is always a human. Yeah. So maybe it's time for a little bit of a change of perspective. So I'm going to paraphrase Monica Chain. She's the co-founder, chief strategy officer at Logic Hub. She said, for years, we've been kind of stuck in a rut of looking for needles in haystacks, right? The needle changes, the haystack gets bigger, but we keep thinking about our problem set that way, right? Like there's just some signature that I'm going to need to find. There's just some bug, there's just some vulnerability, there's just some exploit we haven't seen yet. It's all about finding the one, right? And sort of getting rid of the noise. And all of the examples that I pulled up from earlier, they fall into this category, and they are excellent work. I highlighted these because I respect these papers a lot, but they exemplify this framing of trying to find the needle in the haystack. What I've been thinking about a lot lately is the difference between reasoning about the state of our data, which I would say is kind of where our needle in the haystack is coming from, right? And reasoning about the state of our understanding. Right? Reasoning about the state of our data is about what signal can I detect in here? Can I figure out if there are holes in it? Is there any systematic bias in my data? It's assuming that if I just understand the state of my data accurately, then I will understand the world. But our data is fundamentally a sample, and in our case, a sample of a proxy of the behavior that we care about. Right? So I think maybe where we need to shift is thinking about reasoning about our understanding. When I'm trying to explore a hypothesis, right, and I'm seeing a signal that's starting to help me shape that hypothesis, can I provide support? Could my tools provide support for? Does it make sense for me to formulate this specific hypothesis? Does that make sense in the context of what I see? Is that hypothesis testable with the data that I have? That's a question that we don't ask very often. Right? There are a great many hypotheses that can't be tested with packet sniffing data, that can't be tested with, even if you have the full source code of the malware that you care about. Some hypotheses are not about the data. You are not going to find evidence, or rather, you will find it. You will find what you look for, maybe because we're looking for the needle. Okay, so I spent this summer down at NC State thinking a lot about not necessarily cyber applications, but more broadly thinking this shift in a more data science-y focus of a lot of our sort of security-focused or oriented activities. And one of the things that I learned while I was there was, so thinking about data, right? So here I've got, a couple of different unique points of data, and oftentimes when I approach a data set, the first thing that I start to look for are the relationships between those entities, right? What are the relationships between Lily and James and the Mona Lisa and the Louvre, and knowing that those things are connected to each other so that then I can reason about their connections, right? And this is sort of one hop up from a lot of the kinds of data analysis that we do, right? I'm looking for correlations between things. I'm trying to do clustering. But this summer, I learned a little bit more about what happens when you add semantics on top of those connections, right? Maybe you heard of a knowledge graph. Yeah? So keep an eye on Vast Challenge 2023, because we'll be talking about these a lot. But this idea of enriching your data about the what with the connections, and to give those connections semantic meaning, not just weight, right, but logical meaning, to say, when I shift from Lily and James are connected to Lily and James are friends, right? Well, that really changes, because I used to have human-human connections before, but I couldn't distinguish between them. Lily being friends with James and Lily being interested in Da Vinci are two very different relationships. So thinking about these knowledge graphs and how they might inform our reasoning about our reasoning, right? Our understanding about the state of our knowledge. I'm not going to talk too much about I'm not going to talk at all about how to build them, because that's above my pay grade. But I am going to think a little bit about, or maybe pose some questions about where we might go in the next 5 years, starting to think about wanting to support reasoning about reasoning rather than just reasoning about data. So my first question is, what are the kinds of relationships and entities that we even care about? So I grabbed this little screenshot from Styx. That is, you've played with Styx? Yeah, familiar with it? If you haven't, it's cool. It's a way of formalizing the description of these relationships in a cyber context. So in particular, we've got targets, we've got indicators, we've got campaigns, we've got threat actors. And so structuring one's data that way gives us kind of a robust language for being able to build these knowledge graphs. But is that complete? What kinds of relationships, what kinds of entities might emerge in the wake of a global pandemic that shifted how we use networked communication, how we use those kinds of modalities, and at a totally different scale? Are there new entities, are there new relationships that we might need to think about that are reflecting the state of our understanding? How do we invite meaningful interaction? Right? So let's assume some wonderful future world where all the good guys are sharing all of their information, and we have this massive collaboratively generated knowledge graph that shows the state of what all the good guys know. How are we going to let someone interact with that? Right? I'm almost positive it's not a hairball graph, but I'm not even convinced it's visualizing the knowledge graph itself. Right? Sometimes we get really literal about, okay, I've encoded my information in this way, and so rather than thinking about that as a data structure, I'm thinking about that as a visual structure that I should encode explicitly. What kinds of visualizations could we build that run on a knowledge graph, but are not themselves a direct representation of the entity connections? Is that meaningful? Does that spur us toward novel graph visualizations, right? Maybe ones that are not entity and relationship explicit, but are still entity and relationship aware. What kinds of analytics might we have to develop for this, right? So one of the richest parts of this summer experience down at NC State for me was I got to spend 8 weeks working with 15 professional analysts. Some of them cyber analysts, many of them text analysts or OSINT or whatever. But talking with them about this idea of wanting to have support for understanding the state of their understanding, right, rather than just the state of the data, I was shocked. It felt like a broken record of them pushing back on the assumption that I had made. The thing they kept saying that they wanted most is anything that was a counterexample to their current hypothesis. Right? I thought of all of the systems that I had built to help them gather supporting evidence, right? And the thing that they were so hungry for was, I need to know if my hypothesis is wrong. I need to know if my beliefs about the state of my understanding are inaccurate, right? I can dismiss information that I try to fit into my mental model, but the analysts are aware of what we have been saying about visual perception for years, right? That it's happening at a higher cognitive level as well. Updating your mental model is expensive. We don't want to do it. And so unless we are confronted with irrefutable evidence repeatedly and at a very loud volume, we will continue to believe what we already believe. We were talking about this also in the visualization literacy working group. We, the Viz community, are very uncomfortable admitting that our job is to manipulate people, right? Our job is to change how people are thinking, right? We try to convince ourselves that we're benevolent about it and that we would never do it to be misleading or whatever. But let's call it what it is, right? Our job is to shape human understanding, right? If we don't acknowledge that that's what we're doing, if we continue to have hubris that somehow we are unbiased and benevolent, right? We're gonna manipulate them, but we're not gonna know how. We're not gonna understand the implications. So let's think about that, especially in this adversarial context, right? Where being wrong is dangerous. What kinds of analytics do we need to develop to support that reasoning about reasoning? I'm gonna amplify Joe Wood's voice because he said something that really caught my attention in VizSec, where he annexed off part of his talk to give us a quick crash course in literate visualization, which is different from visualization literacy, right? And what he was saying about literate visualization is this is visualization that embeds the questioning process, the narrative building, the hypothesis testing in the construction of the visualization, and uses the visualization as a catalyst for exploring those themes, right? The same way that reading a story evokes the building of a world in your mind, and that there are certain skills that are required in order to engage in that meta-reasoning, in that world building, in that hypothesis testing. That can happen in the construction of visualizations too. He built some beautiful observable notebooks for his work on the VAST Challenge this year, and I followed his whole analysis. From beginning to end, I could walk through that process, and it felt like I was sitting side by side with him, even as I was looking at it in a static context. So what might literate cyber analysis look like? How might we build tools that support not just getting to the right mental model in the end, but being able to trace how you got there? Yeah. So I am, I think, almost out of time. So I'll end on what I am really excited about, which is the talks that are coming up after mine, right? So I am super excited for each of these. I managed to get Steve to give me all the proceedings in advance, so I was up till 3 o'clock reading all these papers and getting excited about them. I think our first talk is going to be from Adrian from University of Zagreb, who's going to talk about the analysis of the design space for cybersecurity visualizations in VizSec. I love this idea, right? Thinking about this, to me, is a perfect example of, as a community, reasoning about our reasoning, right? What do we think the constraints are on our design space? We can look retrospectively and think about, well, what designs have we come up with? We know that that's a lossy process because there are lots of them on the cutting room floor. But what made it through the gauntlet, right? What we ended up with as part of our canon tells us something about what we think the constraints must be. So Then we're thinking about, we're kind of going down into the low-level kind of forensic stuff, talking about class activation maps. So this is, I think, Igor, you're going to be presenting that one. Thinking about how do we communicate about AI classification at this really low level, very fine granularity of information. Then I think, Kuhu, you're going to be up next talking about, talking about their work on Portola. So I love that you're thinking about how do we visualize connections. So this is this hybrid tree and network visualization technique that's going to help us do network segmentation. Do I understand the physical landscape of my network? And do I understand its topology? Then I think Kaustav from New Jersey Institute of Technology is going to talk about visual analytic workflows for proactive privacy risk inspection on open data. I love this, right? So how do we build these tools? This is an example of a tool that's, or a workflow support system that's helping us to think about how we're thinking about this process. How are we doing this risk assessment on this type of data? And then we'll end with Maria. This will be a virtual talk, I think, but looking at visual firewall log analysis. So how do we understand the trade-offs between something that's analytical and something that's aesthetic, something that's pleasurable to use, inviting? Oh, look at that, landed right at 10 o'clock. So, right, I'll show the iceberg picture. This is obligate for anyone who's talking about sort of a cyber threat landscape, right? And I'm preaching to the choir here, right? We know what we know. We have our known knowns and we know how to look for them, right? We can describe their signature, we can build a detector, we can automate that. And you know, the hard part there is keeping up with the next threat signature. There's some stuff that we know we don't know, right? That we know we want to go find out. So for example, what time did this distributed denial of service attack start from? Where did it originate? I might not have that information now, but I know that I want it. So we go deeper down, we have these sort of tacit analytical behaviors, norms in our discipline, right? These things that we operate on as we approach these problems, but we don't always externalize them, right? What are our assumptions? What are our norms? What are our understandings of a design space? What are our beliefs about the sort of humanity of the actor on the other end that we're trying to detect? Have we simplified them down to just a bot? Does it make sense for us to think about, well, why was this attack deployed? What was the supposed gain? What were the pressures that were acting on the agent that decided to initialize or initiate that attack? And then we got the fun stuff, right? All of that stuff. We don't know what it is, and we don't know that we don't know what it is, right? So I want to give a shout out to my spouse who is home currently single parenting our 2 kids. Thanks, Morgan, for enabling me to be here. And I also wanted to give a shout out to my kids themselves. I promised them that I would find some way to do this, and I'm really proud of tying it in, right? So I'm going to invite you to follow me over the next 5 years into the unknown. And I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you so much for the invitation. And if you want to get in touch with me, there you go. I can just sit. I'm going to sit up here. All right, we're going to have story time with Grandpa Jordan. There we go.
Okay, so I'm going to have to do this off my laptop.
That's fine.
It tried to run a management task about 45 seconds ago, so I may lose the Slido. So if you have any questions for Jordan, use Slido. Yeah, don't yell it out. You got to use the Slido. You're supposed to use the Slido.
Or you can go to the microphone.
They weren't supposed to have microphones in these. Yeah.
Oh, well, we're small enough.
Well, okay, so I can ask what we have on the Slido, and if we finish and we still got time, we can do open mic. So one of the questions that popped up, so speaking of encodings, what do you think the role of the abstraction aggregation is when you're looking at security data? So what's the role of abstraction or aggregation? Where small details could be the difference between normal or scary data.
Yeah, I love this, right? So we have a scale problem in two directions in kind of the VizSec world, right? So our volume of data is enormous because we collected at such a fine granularity. And so because of that, we're sort of forced to aggregate, right? Or summarize or something. But the actual signal that we're looking for is in those tiny details. So oftentimes when we aggregate, we have made it impossible for ourselves to actually see the thing that we needed to be able to look for. So I'm really curious about the idea of maybe considering some nonlinear approaches to doing that, right? Like what would it look like to be able to compress the boring parts and leave the interesting bumpy parts of our time series or whatever. And then, well, okay, so that's great, but that breaks the mental model that we, the Viz world, have been building up forever and foray, which is don't lie about the distribution of the data, right? So how are we going to communicate that we have compressed something in a nonlinear fashion that, if I'm showing you a timeline, do I just do the crosshatches? That's not very satisfying. What if it's not a time series? But so figuring out how do we do these kinds of selective compression that enable us to still see those low-level signals when there's a signal to see, right? And sort of compress other areas down to be able to kind of say, this is all consistent. How do we then communicate the duration or the volume that's been compressed in that sub-area if it wasn't linear?
Okay. Yeah, and so just, so this wasn't a question, but someone made a comment that your point about just the open-endedness of analysis goals really resonates. A lot of cyber defenders don't have, or they can't rely on, attack signatures. Okay, another question. How do you think COVID impaired reasoning about our understanding in cases where basically a lot of teams went remote? So their comment is collective understanding matters.
Yeah. So I think about this on a couple of levels. So I'll start with, I think, what is the situated in the application domain level, but then I'm going to also talk about the Jordan level. So I think that as much as we want to believe that there's some way that we can make technology transparent and that we can just feel the same way being 10,000 miles apart as we do sitting next to each other, I am not convinced that that is true. And I think some of that is because I think part of our social engagement is a perceptual task. I think that some of how we relate to one another, some of how we communicate with one another, it's an embodied act, right? And so to say, okay, well, our team can still work together all the same hours, they can still see each other's faces, they can still screen share, they can still do all of those things. I still don't think it's the same as walking down to somebody's office and knocking on their door. And it's not, it's not just because I'm a stodgy, curmudgeonly liberal arts college professor, although that's, part of it. But I think that if we were to, have a little widget plugged into the brain, I think we would see cognition happening differently, right? That the way that we are thinking about human as resource that I can get information from, some of that is triggered by many millennia of evolution of thinking about humans that are in close proximity to us as close resources. So that's kind of a hand-wavy question, and I would love to chat more with whoever Slido'd that, so come find me. But the Jordan question, or the Jordan answer to that question is informed by who I'm married to. So I'm married to a trauma-informed clinician. And through the lens of being trapped together in our tiny house for 3 years, I have learned a lot about how trauma affects humans. This is, as far as I can see, the largest collective trauma in human history, right? It's not the biggest trauma that any one subpopulation has faced, but it is one of the first times that nearly every human being has experienced some sort of trauma at the same time. That has manifested differently, but that means that we are not going to engage with each other socially, collaboratively, the same way anymore. We know that trauma affects those kinds of things, totally outside the context of academic collaboration, right? The way that humans interact with each other when one or both of them are mediating those interactions through trauma is not the same as before it happened. I don't know how to integrate that into my scholarship, but I do know that the human behaviors that we are going to see going forward, we won't be able to predict them based on the models we have before. I think that those interactions, how collaboration works, how it unfolds, how we build trust in one another, how we become skeptical of other people's behaviors, I think all of those things are going to be impacted by this collective experience. And I think that our tools are going to have to reflect that.
Okay, so a question just came in that I think actually kind of riffs on this really well. So you talked a little bit about challenges inherent in evaluating security tools because they may be used by operators or experts. So you say we're gonna have to build different tools. What are your thoughts on evaluating these tools? Maybe more effectively, or do we need to change how we evaluate them?
Yeah, I love this. There's a very smart grad student at NC State right now. His name is Grant Forbes. And I spent quite a bit of time this summer with him just geeking out about metrics. Metrics. He's a mathematician by training. And one of the things that he taught me while we were there and that we spent a lot of time thinking about was this idea of ensemble metrics, right? So that we, instead of trying to find like the right yardstick to measure all of our systems against, what if we just admit that they're all bad, right? But we sort of borrow from this wisdom of crowds idea that even if you take a whole bunch of really noisy, mostly ignorant signals or sensors, if you aggregate them together, you get something that's pretty good. So I think that taking an ensemble approach to evaluating our systems, to thinking about, well, how does this support reasoning on predefined tasks? How does it support confidence building in an open-ended task? What does the operator fatigue look like, right? Knowing that none of those signals are actually telling us the right answer about whether or not a system is good. But I think asking those questions from a lot of different angles and sort of having a shared agreement about these are the levels at which when we ask about a system being useful or being effective, we're not just talking about one level. I think regardless of which level the data is coming from, I think reasoning about the efficacy of the system in a layered way is maybe a way forward, but that's kind of a Jordan guess. That's where I'm gonna go. So you can follow me there if you want.
Okay, yeah, I like that answer. Okay, so last question on Slido, and then we can go to Roomco if we have time left. Can you expand a little bit on your idea about literate visualization in the context of VizSec?
Sure.
Like how could you see it being implemented into these types of research?
Yeah, so just making exceptionally clear that the literate visualization idea is from Joe Wood. It's not mine. I have just adopted it because I think it's really cool. But please go talk to Joe lots and lots about that. And in fact, keep an eye on CGNA because Joe's vast challenge submission was our award-winning paper selection this year. So I would imagine that there will be lots and lots of his thoughts in that CGNA paper. But so thinking about this idea of literate visualization, this idea that visualization can be used we use it for exploratory data analysis all the time, right? But EDA is about understanding your data, understanding the patterns that are going on in your data. When I'm thinking about literate visualization in the context of cyber, I'm talking about building visualizations that help us reason about our understanding, right? So rather than a magnifying glass, it's a mirror, right? Can we use visualization to help us test, is the way that I am currently understanding this problem accurate? Is the way that I'm currently understanding this problem, does it make sense in the context of the signal of the data, right? So one of the examples that Joe gave about the vast challenge is, so I simulated all of this data. We had people walking around a fictitious town, but I didn't give them any units for how quickly they were moving. And so he was like, well, if I interpret this as 1 unit is 1 meter, that means one thing. If I interpret it as 1 unit is 10 meters, that's a very different thing. And so he used visualization and animation to interrogate that, right? To say, I could have just made this arbitrary choice, and when he emailed me about it, I said, I'm not telling you. And so he was able to determine for himself which one of those kind of made more sense, which, if it was a coin toss, right, he gave himself some way to reason about which one of these makes more sense, not in the context of the data, but in the context of what I know about how humans move around cities, right? In the context of cybersecurity, or context of VizSec, that might be, does this make sense in the context of what I know about how this actor has behaved in the past? Does this make sense in the context of what I know about the topology of my network? Does this make sense in the context of what I know about the political relationship between these entities, between these actors? Right? Thinking about how we might design visualizations, design analytics, and design tools that use them both to bring in that external context, or at least to give the operator a way to act on that external context in a way that is legible to someone who looks at the results of the analysis later, I think are the sort of key here.
Okay, I think we're right at 10:15, so I think this is a good break point. So let's all thank Jordan for doing our keynote today. And we'll be back here at 10:45 for our paper session.